soil health really is built on the backbone of soil organic matter, okay? So you probably hear a lot about soil organic matter and how important it is. Well, that's because it is. It has a tremendous impact on the physical qualities of soil, chemical qualities, and biological qualities. Just some of the major ones I'll point out here is enhancing soil structure, right? So what do we mean by soil structure? Well, that's the way the soil beds fit together, right? And that's important because that dictates how much air and water movement can go through a particular soil. So that's really important for root growth and crop yields. Also, nutrient storage and release is a big one, and water flow is huge, right? So when we tend to have better soil structure, we have more pores in the soils that the air and water can move through, and that's very critical from a crop production and environmental standpoint, as we'll talk about. Okay, so with that surface runoff, right? It's a big deal right now, right? We've had a lot of rain, we see a lot of water coming off fields, and this is erosion in action right there, right? So when we have these concentrated flows like this, we're losing sediment, but what else are we losing? We're losing phosphorus, right? So most of the phosphorus loss from our fields is driven by erosion and surface runoff, okay? So that's just something to keep in mind here. So I don't want to bore you with the nitrogen cycle here, but again, some context, really important to keep the idea of how complex the nitrogen cycle is, okay? Again, largely driven by weather, okay? So all these factors down here, soil drainage, fertility, right? How much nitrogen are we putting on? How much organic matter in the soil, manure rates, things like that. And of course, cropping systems management, all these affect nitrogen cycling. A couple things I want to point out here though. So one of the major loss mechanisms in our fields is volatilization of urea, so that's NH3, okay? So when urea can be quickly converted to this NH3, which is volatile to the atmosphere, so this turns out to be a huge loss of nitrogen from manure application and from fertilizer application, okay? So that's why incorporating is a big deal and conserves a lot of nitrogen, and we'll talk more about that. So the two plant available forms of nitrogen that you should be aware of are ammonium, so that's NH4 plus, and nitrate nitrogen, okay? So these two are both available to the crop. Ammonium nitrogen is a little bit stickier. It can be held by soil exchange sites, whereas nitrate is very water soluble. And as soon as nitrogen is in this nitrate form, it can be washed, leached to tiles, leached to groundwater, or just otherwise lost from the system. The other thing that can happen once we're in this nitrate form is this can be lost to the atmosphere, just like ammonia can, right? So when oxygen becomes limiting in wet soils, microbes start to go for the oxygen and nitrate to respire, and what happens is we lose nitrogen back to the atmosphere in one of these three forms, okay? Which two of those are greenhouse gases, I'll just point out. Okay, so now we'll zone in here a little bit more on manure and farms. So just a little bit big picture on nitrogen, what we call mass balance. If you think about a farm of all the nitrogen sources coming in and those leaving the farm, okay? So the top graph, it's a kind of busy here, so I'll walk you through this. This comes from several large farms across the country, you can see here. So California, Idaho, large, small. I'm not gonna read them all, you can see. But if we look at the percentage of nitrogen exported from these farms, what do you notice up here? Well, what are the big ones? So ammonia, we just talked about, or environmental loss, right? So that's these green bars. So environmental losses would include denitrification, volatilization, leaching, the things that we were just talking about on the nitrogen diagram, right? But what are the other big exports? Well, milk and animals are pretty high, you know, somewhere around 40% or so on average. So that's good. But those environmental losses are significant, right? When we're talking about more than 50% of our losses are coming from environmental losses. So that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to improve our management and improve our bottom line by capturing more of that nitrogen, particularly from manure application, which we'll be getting into here. So if you look at the bottom, that's just breaking out those environmental losses by the different mechanisms. And again, a volatilization, that NH3 is huge, right? Right across all those farms, we're losing a lot of nitrogen to ammonia loss, and that's pretty typical. So manure on hay forage crops. So in general, I think there's more manure being applied to hay crop forages in general, and there may be some different reasons for that. So one is fertilizer's not cheap, right? Milk price is low. So the more we can use manure to meet our NP and K needs, the better, right? We're going to cut down that fertilizer bill. That's not a bad thing. Some farms have a limited land base for manure application, okay? So that's another driver. The other driver is environmental aspects like CAFO regulations, right? So if you have highly leachable soils or a lot of phosphorus in your soil, then that's going to limit the amount of manure that you can apply to your corn ground, for example, right? So that might in turn mean that more of your alfalfa and alfalfa grass stands are going to get some more manure, okay? So where, when, and how? So I'll just go over this kind of quickly. So one of the things we want to think about is where can we use manure in the system, right? Where are there opportunities to get manure and get those nutrients utilized by the crops we're growing? So where? So established stands before new seedings, and then at stand termination is a typical place for manure, right? Whether it's a spring or fall seeding. So let's just go with the established stand, right? So when do we want to apply to an established stand? Well, as soon as possible, right? So the second you get that hay harvested, the quicker you can get that manure on, the better, right? So once the regrowth starts, you're gonna start having higher risk for damage and yield loss, particularly with alfalfa, right? Alfalfa does not like to be driven on. The crowns are very sensitive, okay? So as soon as possible, and then how? Well, typical way is to broadcast, right? But injection is better, and I'll share some data with you on that. New seedings, spring or summer, as I mentioned. How? Inject, incorporate, moderate rates. So we want to, we don't want to be putting 10, 15,000 gallons of liquid manure on before a seeding. That's a little high, right? So your salt index is high, things like that. It's just too high. So you want to think about moderate rates there. And then stand termination. Now, typically, this has been the place where we just put lots of manure on. It's like, oh, we're going to hit that. We're going to spray it with Roundup, and it's going to corn next year. We're going to put lots of manure on there. Turns out that's not the best idea because, right, when we kill a sod or an alfalfa stand, we get a lot of nitrogen release in that next year or even in that fall, depending on the weather. So if you add manure on top of that, you're really overwhelming the system with nitrogen. And so you're going to lose a lot of that over the winter. And so it's not really a good idea to put a lot of manure on before you terminate a stand. Okay? So just keep that in mind. So what about manure on established hay? So these are my top 5 here. So as we just mentioned, apply as soon as possible, right? Avoid compaction. That's a big one, particularly for alfalfa, but also grass, right? So if the soil's wet, stay off of it, right? If you can. So that's a huge one. Focus on grass alfalfa. So what do I mean by grass alfalfa? Well, if the content of grass is greater than 60%, we tend to see a greater response from manure in terms of nitrogen, okay? So not that you can't put manure on an alfalfa stand, but we tend to see better results when there's some component of grass in the mix. Now, if we can inject or incorporate, I think that's a good thing. We capture a lot more of that ammonia nitrogen, and we have more phosphorus remaining in the soil and less subject to runoff, so that's good. And then again, moderate rates on hay fields, right? For the most part. Maybe a heavy grass stand, we can go a little bit above 5,000 gallons an acre, assuming something else isn't limiting. So just a little bit on manure nutrient content, okay? One thing I want to point out is just how variable manure nutrient content is. So you probably hear people like me say, don't just use a book value for NPK of manure, and this is why. So look at the range. These data come from University of Wisconsin over 1998 to 2010. And so just I want you to focus on the dairy liquid here, so NPK going down, and look at the range, 1 to 125 pounds per 1,000 gallons of total nitrogen. That's a really big range, right? And the same goes for P and K. So I don't want to belabor the point. I just want to, the take-home message here is that if you're working with an agronomist or if you're not on your cropping, you really need to test that manure at least once a year. So then you know what you have and you can feel confident at delivering those precise or more precise NP and K rates for crops, okay? Okay, so now we'll get into a little bit more of the manure application specifics. So probably you all are familiar with these. Surface broadcast, the golden standard, if you will. Here, some sort of tillage incorporation. This guy happens to be hooked up to a drag hose, but basically this is a disc incorporator, okay? Here we have shallow disc incorporation, and then banding with an aerator, okay? So these two on the right here are two methods that we've been working with over the past few years up at the Marshfield Ag Station. So here's just a kind of a cross-section view at some of these different tools. Here's a sleigh foot or a traveling shoe here. That would be this, or a chisel type injector. Okay, so obviously if you're a no-till farm, you would not want to use this, right? So here's a shallow disc injector, aerator, and the chisel and the sweep. Okay. Okay, so real quick, this information's coming from Cornell University, but if you look across different land grant recommendations, you'll see this general relationship. So what we have here is the relationship between percent ammonia loss, right, that NH3, versus days until incorporation, okay? And what you can see is this logarithmic increase, right, in loss with time. So basically, if we apply manure broadcast, right, we don't incorporate it, we just leave it on the surface, we're going to lose about 70% of that ammonia N in that manure after just a week, okay, if we don't do anything, if it doesn't rain or anything, okay? If it rains, we're going to get some of that, right? But this is just to show you, it's a pretty fast reaction. We lose ammonia really quickly, so the quicker we can get that incorporated via tillage or injected, we're going to save a lot of that nitrogen. Okay, a little bit on the costs here. So the top table here is just looking at initial costs for the equipment. And these are averages, of course, so take it with a grain of salt. But let's focus on the large and small dairy here. So here we have broadcast no-till, so we're just broadcasting. Broadcast with tillage incorporation, aerator banding, and shallow disc injector. So you can see the price to buy that equipment, right? So obviously, the injection equipment is more expensive, right? That's not a surprise. So if we look at this on a income and net return basis, so this is using a partial budget and trying to incorporate the added benefit of keeping some of that ammonia nitrogen, okay, by incorporating. What you'll notice is, and this is in US dollars per cow across the bottom, so here are 4 treatments across the bottom. Now, I don't know about you, but those bars look pretty similar to me across these different incorporation methods. So if we believe these numbers, we can say that there's just not a lot of economic differences between these 4 methods, okay, based on these numbers. Okay, so just a little bit more on the ammonia N loss by a different method here. And these percentages are relative to that surface application, okay? So I don't want to belabor the point here, but in general, let's focus on the forage here, because we're going to talk more about forage. So if we look at that aerator banding, so 33% less ammonia N loss. In disc injection, we do a little bit better, 20 to 75% less ammonia loss. So again, proving that point that the quicker we can get that incorporated, the better off. Now here's some work from my predecessor, Bill Jokola, who's done quite a bit of work on different low disturbance and manure incorporation techniques over the years. And so this orange line here, This is the broadcast surface, right? So this is in pounds per acre of nitrogen. And this is going for about 2 days here, so 48 hours after manure application. So you can see that we lost, let's see, about 14 pounds of ammonia nitrogen in just 2 days. And I should say this was in the fall, right? This is November, pretty cool temperatures, right? And it even rained. But we still lost 14 pounds of N with that surface broadcast application in just 2 days. So it's quite rapid, even in cool conditions. And you can see the other treatments, how they fall out here. But long and short, the strip till inject and the coulter or the shallow disc injector were much, much more effective at capturing that ammonia nitrogen. Okay, so here's the same data looking at what the corn yields did. And I think this is kind of interesting here. So the best results in terms of yield, this is dry matter tons per acre, was that sweep inject. And then going down here to the broadcast. So basically the no nitrogen control yield and the broadcast manure were statistically similar in yield. There's no difference. So what does that say? So all that manure that we broadcast on the surface, I mean, in terms of yield, it didn't do anything, right? So we might as well not even have spread the manure if we believe these numbers, right? So no difference in yield. So it really goes to show you that if we can capture some fraction of that ammonia nitrogen, we're gonna have a better yield potential at the end of the day. So Bill also looked at phosphorus runoff losses as part of this work. This was simulated rainfall on field plots, okay? And what do you see here? So biggest losses with that surface broadcast, no surprise. About half the phosphorus was particulate P, which is phosphorus bound to soil particles. Remember I said erosion, right? And then the other half was soluble reactive or dissolved, DRP, dissolved reactive phosphorus. And that's phosphorus that's bioavailable. So crops can take it up. It also fuels algae, okay? So the water quality people get pretty excited about this DRP number here. So if they were to look at something like this, they would say, wow, the water quality is a lot better when we inject that manure, right? It's in fact, there's no statistical difference in phosphorus loss between the strip till and the plots that got no manure, which is encouraging, I think, from a production standpoint. Okay, so a few slides here on some of the recent work that we've been doing up at Marshfield, and my technician Jessica Sherman has been leading the way on that for the past couple years. So why do we care about low disturbance application besides the fact that we can save nitrogen? Well, low disturbance is important in no-till settings and for forage stands, right? We don't want to beat up our forage stands when we apply manure and take a big yield hit, right? Just to have a better environmental outcome, right? We got to be thinking about the yield and economics at the same time. So this is just to show you that these low disturbance methods compared to some of the traditional ways of applying manure, such as tillage incorporation, right? We really do have a lot less disturbance with the low disturbance methods. So let's see a good example here with the disc injection here, shallow disc. So 83 to 89% of the small grain stubble was still there after manure application. So that's pretty good. So it's not disturbing the soil and leaving that residue or live crop as it may be intact for the most part. So here's some, this is kind of busy, so I apologize, but here's some work that we've done, or Jess has done over the past couple years. And I just want to point out here, so the yellow is the percent manure coverage. So these were taken, each plot was taken, a picture was taken with a camera. And then you have this tricky software that can tell you what proportion of the image is covered by live vegetation versus manure versus soil, okay? So you can see 7 different rainfall simulation events on this alfalfa grass plots. And so the thing to note is other than right after manure application, we didn't really see a lot of differences in terms of the live crop. So if you just look at the green bars, that's the percentage of live crop. So at the end of the day, there were no statistical differences between the percentage of live crop between these different methods, which suggests to us that the yield loss or yield potential would be also similar across these different methods, okay? So that's good news. So a quick look at the water quality runoff here. And this is the average water quality concentrations over these 7 events. So real quick, the red bars are the control, so no manure on the red bars. Green was the surface broadcast. Band has the stripes, okay? Aerator plus band is the orange. And the shallow disc injection is the blue. So long and short, the shallow disc injection system seemed to do the best in terms of reducing phosphorus runoff and concentration. So this is just the concentration of nutrient. This is not the load, but the loads or the amount that came off each plot pretty much followed the same trend as these concentrations, okay? So what's interesting to note here again is that shallow inject was basically significantly lower than the other 3 treatments and was very similar to the control that had no manure. Okay, so that's good news. We can get the benefit of the manure, but not get the negative effect when it rains, right? So if we can capture that manure, keep it protected, keep the nitrogen in the ground, and at the same time keep that phosphorus less vulnerable to surface runoff, that's a good thing. So as y'all know, the manure application equipment is rapidly evolving. Maybe that's why some of you are here, not just for the manure equipment, right, but to get the latest and greatest on all the farm equipment. And so I'm still getting up to speed on it myself. So just keep that in mind. I'm sure, hopefully you've gotten to look at some of that equipment today. So here, it's another shallow disc incorporator, or injector, excuse me. And this is a particular version can go around corners. So one of the issues with these is you have to pretty much drive straight. Well, now they have these units that you can just keep in the ground and you can make those turns, and right, you can hook up to GPS so you can have variable rate manure application based on your soil fertility. And that's kind of where things are going, at least on larger scale farms. Okay, what do you guys think about side dressing manure for corn, right? Yeah, how logistically complicated, right? But it seems like a good idea, right? We have a lot of manure. We generally have more than we can utilize, right? So if we can figure out a way to utilize that liquid manure in our corn ground, right? What a great benefit, at least agronomically, hypothetically, right? If we could use that nitrogen to a growing corn crop. Makes sense to me anyway. So anyway, there are some farmers that are trying this and having some success with it. In fact, a recently published study out of Minnesota showed that summer fertigation with liquid dairy manure increased manure nitrogen use efficiency by a whopping 127% over the control. Now that's pretty amazing to me. Again, it might not be logistically feasible in every system, but it's something to think about. So one of my cousins has a big dairy farm down in central New York, Finger Lakes region, and he's over the years developed this, what he calls the nutrient boom. And this is a piece of equipment that works in tandem with a drag hose. And basically it's an automated manure application system. So you set this thing up and you can more or less walk away, but it's not quite to that level yet. But the idea is it has these long drop hose, and you can side dress manure in a standing corn crop up until 7 feet canopy height. So that's pretty amazing. So they got some money a couple years ago to work with Cornell University to do some field trials with this. And that's what I'm going to share with you here. So on the left here, we have the corn grain yield, and then a fertilizer application rate. So they also did a full N rate study with this, which is kind of cool. So what do you see here? Well, the plots that didn't get any manure, right? We see that typical yield response curve with added nitrogen, right? So as we increase our nitrogen, right, our yield goes up and flattens out. Well, we've all seen that. But look at the manure plots. No yield response to the added nitrogen where that manure was side dressed, right? And in fact, what they found was the manured plots yielded significantly more than the fertilizer-only plots. So the corn crop was getting more than just nitrogen, right? It could have been some of the water, micronutrients, PK. So it's kind of like the manure priming effect, if you will, right? We get a yield bump from adding manure, and it's not just from one particular element. It's from multiple factors, okay? So here on the right, it's just kind of breaking it out by corn hybrid. Again, you can see that same trend, right? In 2017, no yield response for those manure. So this is encouraging. I think if we could, handle the logistical part, I think side dressing makes sense for corn if we can make that happen. Okay, so weighing your options here, we're going to wrap up here. There's a lot of things to consider when we're talking about manure management, right? A lot of factors to consider: economic, environmental, and otherwise, logistic, neighbor relations, odor. So the point is, it's not an easy decision. So you want to work with your crop advisor, work with your consultants, and really push the pencil on this. Really push the pencil, and really, I'd encourage you to think about injection. And if you're not incorporating and you are a conventional tillage system, to really think about ways that you might be able to get more bang for your buck for your manure. So summing up, compared to surface broadcast, low disturbance application, well, we have a lot greater ability to capture that ammonia, as I hope I've gotten across, up to 90% in some cases. We maintain that residue, or our forage crop if we're injecting in a forage system. We have reduced phosphorus runoff losses, similar yield potential, we think, so far, greater nutrient use efficiency. And while it may take a longer time to inject, the net return is similar, okay? So that's something to think about. And then the final point I'll make is that manure management, we talked a lot about manure management in the last 45 minutes, but it's just one part of the system, right? Our ag systems are systems, right? They're interrelated. There's a lot of factors going on. And so things like whether we're using cover crops or not, our soil fertility program, our soil types, all those things have a major impact. So this is just one piece of the puzzle to think about. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions, and thanks for your attention. Hope I didn't scare you all away. Yep.
The one screen you showed surface application manure, you lose 70% of the nitrogen instead of 80. Then you also talked about nitrogen in your waterways and in the streams. But that nitrogen loss is to the air.
Right. Yeah, in that situation, it would be, we're talking specifically about ammonia. And ammonia, once it's in ammonia form, it's complete. Sorry about that. Thanks, Mike. The ammonia is volatile, so it will, so it could be in the ammonium form, which is NH4+. But once it gets converted to ammonia, it's volatile. So if it's near the surface, it's going to go right to the atmosphere. Oh, good question. So his question is, does the nitrogen that volatilizes from ammonia loss, does it come back down in precipitation? And the answer is yes. Some of it does, yep. So depending on where you are in the country, we can get as much as 10 to 20 pounds per acre per year just from rainfall. Just from rainfall, nitrogen. Absolutely, yep. But that's not to say that all the ammonia and that's lost from our fertilizer and manure applications comes back down in the form of rain, but certainly some fraction of it does. That's actually a really good question. The other thing to note is there has been research that's looked at how far the ammonia travels from manure applications, and in many cases that ammonia doesn't travel too far off site, so it'll volatilize up, but it will be carried and then redeposited in more regionally or locally as well. So that type of thing can happen too. Mike?
Does this change any with, so these are C3, C4 grasses?
So C3 versus C4, that's a good question. So that's a really good question. I don't have a lot of experience with the C4s. So my general sense is that I wouldn't see a lot of differences in the nitrogen dynamics between cool season grasses and warm season. Other than obviously the cutting cycle is a lot different. Warm season you'd only maybe get 1 or 2 harvests. So from that standpoint, I think cool season grasses would be more nitrogen efficient because we get more cuttings and we can apply more nitrogen. But yeah, that's a good question. No other takers? You're all experts now? Well, thanks for coming. Yeah. So the question is, the airway bar is not that effective. Well, in our study, it was. It was pretty close to the shallow disc injector. Not quite as good for phosphorus and nitrogen, but it was definitely better than, absolutely, way better than surface. Yep, and fairly, at least in the range of the shallow disc injector. Yep. So I think that's a good option. The one thing you have to be careful though is if you use, well, compaction is always an issue, but I've read enough studies to know that with the aerator, if you use it when there's too much moisture in the soil, you can actually increase surface runoff, and not right. So some cases, the idea was that would help infiltration into the soil, but if you don't use it at the right time, it can actually increase surface runoff, right, in like a clay soil or something like that. So you got to be careful. All right, thanks everybody.